Hello guys. Yeah, it's been a long time. I recorded our last session. So today I will be walking us through how to create a utility class for returning a modified response. I believe when you are building an API, in order not to confuse the users that are consuming or the clients consuming your API, it is very, very necessary that you send response that are of it, or you send a response format that is uniform. They shouldn't have to be doing guesswork. They should always know where their data is. They should always know where to check the error code and all. So basically, that's what I will be putting us through today, how to create utility response class that we can use to send data in our banking application. So the method we'll be using is basically to create a response rate that we can use across all controllers. So you can easily call the methods in the controller. So I believe so if you don't know much about PHP response rates, I will advise you to look that up. So the first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a folder, and I like to call my trait folder traits. So a trait basically, let me just explain. A trait is basically an object in PHP that you can drop into classes, and you can call the method that you've created in those classes without the class necessarily have to extend or implement and all. So it's basically just a way to give your classes extra methods they can make use of without necessarily extending or implementing an interface or anything of such. So basically, let me start. I'll be calling it API response rates. API response rates. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a function to pass our data and to format it according to our need. So I'll be creating a method which we'll be using to pass our data. I'll call it a private. The reason why I'm using it as private is because we won't need to actually call it outside of the streets. It should be public. Let me just use public function pass response. So this method will be accepting an array of data so that needs to be passed with initialized with an empty array as default, int dollar status code. That is, maybe you want to return a 400, or you want to return a 200, you want to return a 500. That's the purpose of this status code. So the default will be 200, and we can accept an array of headers as well. Maybe you before sending the response to the front end or to the client, you want to like okay, that was a mistake from my end. So you want to attach some sort of headers. Maybe you want to add some extra stuff for the clients to use. So our response structure will have in a response, you have the success attributes. You can have success is double C, I mean. You can have message attributes. That is maybe the error, the message can be an error message, it can be a success message. Then we can also have results. Results is basically what will contain all the data, if there is any, to send to the front end. Then in a response, you can have errors. In a response, you can have, let me just put this in a single line. So we can have errors, we can have exception. So you might want to show the exception in situations whereby you are not in production mode. We can have status. Status is basically maybe like to say successful and all. So we can have so our status is like our status code in our response. So that's like the status code. So we can have error code. Maybe you want to send a custom error code to the client. So let's start. So I'll create the default structure. The default structure of our response is like this. Response, something that a structure we are always sure we are going to have, we are expected to have, I mean. So response structure, let's say response structure will be of, it will be an array, of course. So in our response structure, we can have, as I said, we can have success, success. So our success will come from our data. It will be passed in our data, success. And the default for success will be false. If it is not passed, we assume it is false. Another one we have is message. The data message. This will be assumed to be null if it is not passed. Then results. That is basically the result of what the user has actually done. Maybe a new resource was created or things of such. We also assume it is null. It also have a default of null. So the next thing we need to check is, I told you our response could contain an error. So for example, a validation error occurs. So we can say if is set, if the error response is set, that is $data contains the error's attributes or key, contains the error key. I mean, we can say our response structure errors will be equals to $data errors, right? So the next thing we want to check is we want to check if our data contains a status. Then if it contains a status, we want to set our status code, which is like HTTP status code, to the status that is passed. And also the next thing we need to do is, in order to undo exception, the only time you want to send exception to, so we have to, the only time you want to send exception to the client is if you are still in development mode. If you are not in development mode, I will completely advise you not to send your the following exception format to clients. So the next thing we want to do is we want to check if the exception is set on the data. exception is set on the data. If it is set and if our data exception is an instance of error, which is like the base error when you are working with PHP. Base error is an instance of error, or our exception is an instance of exception base class. So we are checking if the exception is set. We are checking if the exception is an instance of error or the exception is an instance of the exception class. So because we know that our exceptions and errors or anything we are throwing will always be extending either error or exception in PHP. So the next thing, as I said, we now need to construct a nice exception for ourselves. So if our application config our app.environment is not equals to production, that is, we are not in production environment, then we want to set our response structure for exception like this. Our exception key in our response structure, we have the following. The first thing we need is the message from the exception. You can see data, the exception key, then you get message. Let me just copy this. The next thing we check if we also attach the file the exception actually took place. We can also get the line the exception took place. So all of this will make our ability to know where the exception is actually coming from and this code. We can also get the code. So we want to know if it is a bad request, if it is a 500, we want to then trace. Trace is basically to show us how the exception from the hierarchy of the exception, how it actually happened, maybe from controller, from your API, from route to controller, from controller to service, from end to job to anything, you can name it. Exception. So we can get trace. So that's all for now. So then outside this, we can then check if our status code, if there is an exception and our status code is 200, then we want to make sure we set it to 500. So that way, even if you forget to actually set the exception code and you are throwing an exception, you are always sure that the status code is reset back to 500. So once we are done with that, the next thing is we want to check if our data success key, if the success key is false, right? Let me just use double quotes here. If it is false, we now check if data custom error code, don't forget the custom error code we spoke about. If the custom error code uh, error code is equals to, if the custom error code is set, I mean, is set, then we can then say, okay, if it is set, then that means there's an error, right? And we have to make sure. So if it is set, we want to set our error code in our response structure, error code, sorry. Our response code will now be the data error code that was sent to us. Error code that was sent to us. Then also, otherwise, let's give it a default. If it is not set, we can set our response error code. We can just say maybe 200, right? Let's just say 1. So these are just custom error code. I mean, it's not really necessary, but it's one of the things that I do use during the process of development sometimes. So we want to send the contents. So this will return an array. Contents, we understand the purpose of this one, which will be our response structure. Then the status code will be our status code. Then we have the headers, which will basically be the headers passed. Sorry, this should be headers. Getting that spelling wrong. Yeah. So basically, let me walk us through our past response again. For the purpose of this, okay, the spelling is actually wrong. Let me rename to response structure. Yeah. So basically, we are trying to pass the response. Let me call it pass. I think pass response is probably given data. So this data will be coming from our controller. So we want to set it up according to our need. We want to set it up according to our need to make sure that we have a structure that will be followed throughout the process of sending response back to the client or the front end person. So let me close this. So the next thing I will be doing now is, we have an error. Why do we have an error? I'm saying that we have an error. Where is the error? Oh, okay, we didn't put the end of line stuff. End of statements, I mean. So the next thing we want to do now is we want to create an API response that will basically um, that we can reuse across all the other methods that we'll be creating. You will understand as I go on. So I'll call this API response, and it will be public. So basically our API response, I'm not sure we can use private in traits. Can private be used in traits? Okay, so we can use private in traits. So so the next thing is, so in our API response, we'll be expecting data, just like it is here. We'll be expecting this set of data. Let me just copy and paste. So we are expecting this set of data. So we are going to pass it using our API response, pass given data. pass given data, and we are going to pass our data, our status code, and our header. Then we are going to return a proper Laravel response rate, a proper Laravel response using the response helper and JSON. So in the Laravel response goes like this. This will not be an array, sorry. So if we over it, we see that our response is expecting data, status, and headers, right? So that's basically what we are going to give it. So we know that in our past given data, let me open this up. Our given data returns content, status code, and headers. And that is exactly what we need to send. So our mixed data, that is, can be of any type. It will be results, content, then results, status code, then the next thing is results, the key of headers. So basically this is it. This is what so now you can keep using, you can then go ahead to go to your controllers. Let's say let me see a controller that we can use, our authentication controller. Instead of doing this, we can drop the response traits that we've created. We can then drop the traits in this our base controller. We can now say use API response traits, which is basically these traits that we've now created for ourselves. So in your authentication controller, you can just come here and say, instead of this, you can say $this return $this dot API response. And our API response is expecting data, status code, and headers. So our data here will now be user, then we can say user, then the next thing it is expecting is status code. We know our status code will always be 200, so we can simply just leave it like this. Easy peasy, right? It is quite easy. So let's try it out. Let's try it out. So if we go back to our Postman and try to register, let's see what we get. Okay, I need to start my Docker. Sorry, I should have done that before the start of the lecture. The Docker is where my database is. So let me just start Docker, starting. Okay, so my Docker has started. So, okay, I think, yeah, it is running. So it is running, so we are good. So let me just go back to, let me restart this. So I've restarted my Docker now. Now we are getting an error. So let me see, we are still getting HTML error. So I'm not sure of why we are getting that. So after some couple of debugging, I realized the reason why we are getting our error is simply because our Laravel application is returning a validation error. It's returning a validation error, and while sending the request to Laravel, we didn't tell Laravel to actually respond to us in JSON. So that is why every time we send this, we are getting a what do I call it? We are getting an HTML page. So so how did I figure this out? So what I did was the first thing I did was to remove this guy, then come to my authentication controller. If I do dd here, come back here. Now you see that we are going into the controller, but the moment I remove the name that I'm supplying, we are back to the HTML page. So all of this is due to validation error, and we are not rendering it correctly. So to fix this, all you need to do is come to your header and set accept as application JSON, right? And you send. Now you see we are getting there. So if we come back here, remove this, and come back to our register request class, and we uncomment our validations and send again, we get the validation error we should have gotten initially. So, but I don't like the idea that I like to try as much as possible to make the life of my front end, whoever is consuming the API, I like to make their life as easy as possible. So what we are going to do is we are going to create a middleware that will enforce that the user or the accept attribute on the header is always set to this value. So this is what we are going to do. So we make a middleware, call it enforce JSON response. No, that spelling is even correct wrong. JSON response. Yeah, you call it JSON response. So if we go to enforce, so let's delete the one the spelling is not correct. Let's delete. So enforce JSON response. So what we are going to do now is we are going to check if the current request route is not null, and we will also check if the API middleware. Now, our Laravel, naturally in your route service provider, all API requests going to this API part of your application always has this API middleware, every single one. So we can then do this, go to, let's go back to our enforce JSON middleware. So now check if in array, using in array method from PHP, we check if the current request route middleware. So we are checking if API is inside the current request middleware. So this will return an array. This will return an array for us. So we are checking. So if API is in the middleware, then we'll then set our request headers. We now set that attribute accept, and we give it the value. So once we set it, then we now need to go to our, so we now need to go to our kernel under HTTP. This kernel, let me just show you from the folder. There is a kernel inside HTTP folder. So which kind of houses our middlewares? So one thing you need to understand about Laravel middleware is it goes from top to bottom. This will be executed, 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 this will be executed. So we need to place our middleware right at the top. So our middleware will be somewhere app slash HTTP, correct, slash middleware slash enforce I'm wondering why I'm not getting autocomplete. Let me say slash app slash http slash middleware slash enforce. What's the name of our middleware again? Let me check. Enforce JSON response. Enforce JSON response class. Correct. So what happens is once the request comes into the Laravel application, it is going to execute through the API route. It is going to execute this, then execute this, then execute this. So before it gets to our controller, this has already been set. So that way we can afford to remove this accept and click on send, and we still get JSON response. If I comment this out and press send, we'll return back to our HTML. So if I uncomment this and press send, we get our JSON response. So that was why we are having the error that we are getting. So now let's go back to our response helper method. So I'll be creating some couple of response method for us to use. Let me go to API response traits. So the first one I'll be creating is a response trait, a method for us to send success message. So let's say respond success, or let me just say send success. Send success. So our send success method will be expecting some couple of, we expect data that you want to send as response. So this data could be anything, but I'll just call it an array. It could be anything. Let's call it mixed. Mixed. This data could be anything. We are also expecting string, which our success, this could be anything as well. Yeah, that's all for success. We already know status code for success, so we can then say $this.api response data. Our API response is expecting data, which will be an array. We can then say it will be success will be true, of course, for success response true. Then our result will be the data that we are sending. Then our message will be the message we are sending to. So let's just format this formats. So I like it formatted like that. So this is for success. So we can do one for sending error. So our error will be quite different. For errors, we are not expecting data. What we are expecting is message. We are expecting status code, which will be default to be 400. Our status code is expected to be an int. Please try to type int as much as possible. Then we are expecting that you can pass an exception, which will default to be null also, which means it's not compulsory. We can even, I'm not sure if the Laravel version we are using supports this. No, we can't do this here. So this will be no. Can we? I think we can. Let's just leave it like this. Then we are expecting our custom error code, which will be, can set this to 1 or whatever you intend to set it to. So custom error code is just basically some error code that will be particularly associated to your application that the client can use. So the next thing we now need to do is, when we are sending error, we know that our error will always be false, and we don't need data. We need error code. Then we can also send error code, can also send exception if it is provided. Exception, yeah. Then in our response, if we hover it, we see that that's where we supply our status code. Then the headers, I'm not really accepting headers. You can, if you want to send headers, you can send headers. So this is for error. Then we can then go ahead to create one for not authorized. Send unauthorized. So maybe our user is trying to access is trying to access I didn't return return. Okay, so our users are trying to access a resource that does not belong to them. That's when you can send an unauthorized. You can use the unauthorized. So this is definitely an error. So you can say send error, and the message. So this will only be as expecting a message. For this particular one, I'll be expecting a message. So the default will be unauthorized. So the message will be message, basically. So that way we can send for unauthorized access. So return. So basically, let me rename this. Send unauthorized. Thank you. Send error. So we are basically just typing in, telling them, so I will know what we are expecting, basically. So the next one is we can also do for forbidding. Let me just copy this. Forbidding. Send forbidding. So forbidding. So the message will be forbidding. So like that. Then we can also do for internal server errors. Send internal server error. So our internal server error, we can just call it internal server error. So like that. So, and so on and so on and so on. So the next one, the major one that I like to do is for validation. So send validation error errors. So this one will allow us to be able to format our validations and send it. So you see what I'm saying? Validation, validation, exception, exception, illuminates is illuminates that we need exception. So for this, we are sending, we're making use of the, let me see this send error. Does it accept exception? Okay, so we can use the send error as well. Let me just use the API response stuff. API response. So the API response is expecting data. Our data success will be false. Message will be exception dot get message, and our errors will be exception dot get errors. Dot errors, sorry, errors. So yeah, so these are basically the method we will most likely be reusing a lot during the course of the development. So I would have loved to actually show us how this, so in the next so let me just show us how to actually use them in our controller, authentication controller. So instead of doing API response, we can then say send success. The data will now be user, then the user. So this way, so we can then go ahead to create a new user. So because the email has already been taken, phone number has already been taken, so let's use a new phone number and a new email. Okay, phone number has already been taken as well. Let's use 5 and the email too as 5. Now, so now you can see we have our success, we have the message, we have the result. So if we want the message to set, we can then go ahead to provide the message. We can say registration successful. All right. Registration successful. Successful is fine. Successful single L. Yeah. So if we do that again, 6, change this to 6, then we send. Now you can see we have the success is true message. So this way, the clients can easily do to check the result user that was created results.user, and they can access and success and message. So this will be the end of this session. So in this session, we've been able to explain to ourselves how to actually create methods that can be reused across controllers and to format our response to the client or whoever is consuming the API, so that they can always be sure of what each type of status or each type of response will look like. So that will be the end of today, and I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. In the next video, we'll be talking about how to undo exceptions, both custom and inbuilt exceptions in Laravel, and sending the right format for of the error using the response helper or the traits we have created in this session. Thank you.